It's a quiet morning in Kiowa, Kansas. The year is 1900. Bartenders are busy polishing their glasses, and the smell of cigar smoke and whiskey fills the air. Glasses clink and patrons sip whiskey with the lazy confidence of men who thought the world couldn't touch them. No one knew that they were about to become part of a storm. Then she walked in. She stood just 5 feet tall, dressed in black, with fire in her eyes. In one hand she held a Bible, in the other, a hatchet. Carrie Nation wasn't here for a drink. She was here for destruction, fueled by both faith and a burning hatred for alcohol. She raised that hatchet high and brought it down like righteous thunder. Some saw her as a lunatic, but to others she was a legend, fighting to save souls from the scourge of liquor. But one thing was for sure, Carrie Nation was fighting a one-woman holy war in a way no one saw coming. With her controversial crusade against saloons, she carved her name into American history. This is the wild, true story of America's God-fearing, hatchet-swinging temperance warrior. Welcome to History Snob. But we're gonna start at the beginning. Caroline Amelia Moore was born to George Moore and Mary Campbell in Garrard County, Kentucky in November 1846. Her father was a successful man. He was a stock trader, a farmer, and also a slave owner. On paper, the family looked prosperous. But behind closed doors, things were far from perfect. Carrie spent much of her childhood sick and frail. The family's finances, once strong, began to crumble. And darker still, there was the shadow of mental illness hovering over her family. Most notable was Carrie's mother. She experienced vivid delusions on a regular basis. One time, she even believed that she was Queen Victoria. Back in these times, mental illness was highly misunderstood and often ridiculed. What treatment there was, it wasn't generally effective. So, because of these misfortunes, young Carrie's family was forced to move multiple times until they finally settled in Missouri in 1854. As Carrie grew older, life didn't get easier, but she pressed on. In a time when women were expected to marry young, she followed the script. In 1867, at just 21 years old, she married Dr. Charles Gloyd, who was a Civil War veteran and promising young physician. But there was a problem. Charles had a secret that wasn't so secret. He was an alcoholic. And I think it's important to take a moment to consider the culture of drinking in the 19th century. To put it bluntly, booze was everywhere, and drunkenness was commonplace. Before the Civil War, it was standard practice for men to wander in and out of their workplaces during the day, drinking, gambling, and generally having fun. So yeah, work used to be cool. Drinking was also given a seal of approval by doctors and snake oil salesmen alike. Most medicines were basically just liquor mixed with various exotic substances, or hardcore narcotics. Which made sense, because most drugstores were also liquor stores. As more people began crowding into the cities in the wake of the Civil War, living spaces for the poor grew smaller and more squalid. For men working long hours, making little money, and living in cramped apartments, saloons were a welcome and necessary escape. But early in her marriage, Carrie Nation was unfortunate enough to get a front row seat to the damage drinking could cause. As Charles's drinking grew worse, their marriage became unbearable. They ended up separating shortly before the birth of their first and only child. Then in 1869, Gloyd died as a consequence of his binge drinking. This is where her hatred for alcohol really started to form. After the death of her husband, Carrie found herself alone, a widowed mother in a society that offered little to women like her. But she didn't give in to despair. She turned to something deeper. She found solace in faith. Her connection to God became more than just spiritual. It was personal, urgent, and at times even consuming. She didn't just pray, she listened. Carrie also remarried in 1874. This time to David A. Nation, who was an attorney, minister, newspaper journalist, and father, 19 years her senior. In 1889, the couple and their children moved to Medicine Lodge, Kansas, where David found work preaching and Carrie ran a successful hotel. In the town of Medicine Lodge, she helped organize a local chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The Temperance Union was a nationwide organization of women who fought for the banning of alcohol. For 19th century women, drinking was a severe threat. Men who drank to excess were often spending money that women needed to feed the children. They were more violent, and they were more likely to fall sick or die, leaving their families with no source of income. But Carrie wasn't campaigning for new laws in Kansas, just the enforcement of the ones already on the books. Kansas had outlawed liquor, but no one seemed to care. Carrie's method started off simple and harmless enough. Just regular civil protests. But that got no real results. So her next tactic was to go into saloons with a hand organ and serenade patrons with hymns. Slowly, this became more aggressive. She started greeting the bartenders with remarks such as, "Good morning, destroyer of men's souls," but still nothing changed. The beer kept flowing and the bars stayed open. Frustrated and desperate, Carrie turned to prayer, begging God for direction. And on June 5th, 1900, she believed she received her answer. In a vision, she claimed God revealed her true calling. As Nation described it, "The next morning, I was awakened by a voice which seemed to me speaking in my heart. These words, 'Go to Kiowa,' and my hands were lifted and thrown down, and the words, 'I'll stand by you.' The words 'Go to Kiowa' were spoken in a murmuring musical tone, low and soft, but 'I'll stand by you' was very clear, positive, and emphatic. I was impressed with a great inspiration. The interpretation was very plain. It was this: take something in your hands and throw it at these places in Kiowa and smash them." And that brings us to June 6th, 1900, in Kiowa, Kansas, the day Carrie Nation stopped singing and started swinging. Responding to her revelation, Nation gathered several rocks, or smashers as she called them, and made her way to Dobson's saloon. She walked straight into the saloon. No warning, no hesitation. The men inside barely had time to glance up before the mirror behind the bar exploded into shards. In a matter of minutes, she turned the place upside down. Bottles shattered, barrels cracked open, glass and whiskey pooling at her feet. Bartenders standing frozen in disbelief, and the patrons watched in stunned silence. They arrested her, of course, but Carrie didn't resist. She had done what she came to do, and she had only just begun. Word spread like wildfire. Carrie Nation, the preacher's wife from Medicine Lodge, was demolishing Kiowa's favorite watering hole and doing it in the name of God. She destroyed 2 more saloons in Kiowa the same way. Then, shortly after, a tornado hit eastern Kansas. Where others saw destruction and misfortune, Carrie saw a divine approval of her actions. Carrie's saloon-smashing campaign swept through Kansas like a prairie fire. With every shattered bottle came another headline, another arrest, and another step towards infamy. After a particularly rowdy raid in Wichita, her husband tried to make light of it all, half joking and half exasperated, saying, "You ought to use a hatchet next time. Do some real damage." Carrie's eyes sparked with amusement. She replied, "That is the most sensible thing you have said since I married you." From that moment on, the hatchet wasn't just a tool. It was a message, a warning, a line in the sand. Although this suggestion wasn't enough to keep them a happy couple for long. In 1901, they divorced. But there's no going back. Only forward, fueled by mission and momentum. Carrie Nation became a storm no saloon could ignore. Alone or flanked by hymn-singing women, she marched into bars with her Bible in one hand and a hatchet in the other. She'd sing, she'd pray, and then she'd strike. Splintering the bar, smashing bottles, and leaving nothing but broken glass and stunned silence. Between 1900 and 1910, she was arrested over 30 times for these raids. Or, as she called them, hatchetations. Each arrest only fueled her legend. And each fine, paid in full. And it wasn't just out of pocket. It was funded by lecture tours, donations, and something entirely unexpected: merchandise. A Topeka pharmacist began producing tiny hatchet-shaped stick pins. Silver souvenirs engraved with 3 chilling words: "Death to Rum." She sold them by the hundreds. She also wore one on her chest. And with every pin, every speech, every swing, Carrie turned personal crusade into public theater. As she toured the country, speaking in cities and small towns alike, her crusade stirred something long brewing. She wasn't alone anymore. Across the country, women, pastors, and reformers were rising up, demanding change. The Women's Christian Temperance Union swelled in numbers. The Anti-Saloon League gained political ground. The message was echoing from pulpits to Congress. Liquor was not just a personal vice, it was a national plague. And while some dismissed her as a fanatic, many saw her as a prophet, a voice crying out against the destruction caused by alcohol in homes, families, and society itself. Critics mocked her methods and cartoonists lampooned her crusade, but they couldn't deny her impact. She had pushed temperance out of church basements and into the headlines. After one particularly destructive hatchetation in Kansas City, she was arrested, dragged into court, and fined $500, which is equivalent to nearly $19,000 today. The judge, perhaps weary of her notoriety, agreed to suspend the fine, but he had one condition: she was never to set foot in Kansas City again. But this wasn't the last time she'd hear a jail door slam behind her. Once, in Washington, D.C., Carrie was sentenced to the city poorhouse. She spent 3 days behind its bleak walls, all because she refused to pay a modest $35 fine. But to Carrie, these weren't punishments. They were badges of honor, proof that her war was being noticed. By the 1910s, Carrie was aging. Her rates had slowed and her voice was a little weaker. But the fire, it hadn't gone out. She would give her final speech on January 14th in 1911, when she had collapsed midway through, having previously suffered health problems. Nation fell into a coma and was taken to Evergreen Place Hospital, where she eventually died on June 9th, 1911. But she lived long enough to see the movement she helped ignite gather real momentum, with lawmakers, activists, and average citizens rallying around the idea that maybe, just maybe, the country would be better dry. And in 1919, just 8 years after Carrie Nation's death, the impossible happened. Congress ratified the 18th Amendment. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol was now illegal across the United States. Prohibition had arrived. A nationwide experiment in morality, order, and social engineering. Supporters rejoiced. It was a victory decades in the making, and many believed it would usher in a cleaner, safer America. They pictured families restored, crime reduced, and industry improved by sober workers. But the reality would prove more complicated. Illegal speakeasies popped up like mushrooms. Bootlegging became big business. Moonshine was also a problem, often made in rural areas, sometimes in deadly conditions, and organized crime flourished in the shadows of the dry law. For every saloon that was shut down, another opened behind a hidden door. Still, for all of its flaws and unintended consequences, Prohibition was a moment of monumental social change. It marked the first time the US Constitution was used to restrict personal behavior, and it was the crowning achievement of the very movement Carrie had swung into motion. Though the 18th Amendment was repealed just 14 years later, its impact and hers would echo for generations. Carrie may have died long before the country she tried to save would fully reckon with the war she helped ignite, but her name, it lived on. Some remembered her as a hero, a fearless woman who stood up to powerful industries who refused to stay silent while alcohol tore families apart. A woman ahead of her time, demanding change in a world that didn't welcome women's voices. Others see her as an extremist, a zealot with a hatchet, smashing her way through civil liberties in the name of morality. A woman so driven by righteousness that she ignored nuance and left only wreckage behind. And then there are those who view her as an icon, not just of temperance, but of protest itself, a symbol of what it means to disturb the peace in order to expose deeper violence. Over a century later, Carrie Nation remains a polarizing figure, but whether you see her as a saint, fanatic, or something in between, one thing is for certain: she made America look in the mirror. And sometimes it takes a swinging hatchet to make a nation pay attention. So what do you think? Was Carrie Nation a hero, a menace, or a little bit of both? Let us know down in the comments. And thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the past.